"You're not half the woman your sister is," my father said calmly across the dinner table. His fork paused midair like he just shared a fact instead of a verdict on my worth, and my mother nodded beside him as if this had been discussed and agreed upon long before I arrived. So let me be clear from the very beginning about what this story is about. It's about family betrayal, lifelong favoritism, and the slow, quiet way a daughter learns to survive humiliation before finally reclaiming her dignity. And my name is Emily Carter, the daughter who learned that lesson the hard way. The words hit me so fast my body reacted before my mind did. My hands went cold, my stomach tightened, and the sound of the silverware scraping plates suddenly felt too loud, too public, even though it was just the four of us sitting in my parents' dining room in a quiet Ohio suburb, the same room where I'd celebrated birthdays, graduations, and every small achievement they never quite remembered. My sister, Lauren, sat across from me, lips pressed together in a practiced expression of sympathy that fooled everyone except me, her posture relaxed, confident, like someone who knew the outcome of a game before the first move was played. I pushed my chair back slightly, not enough to stand, just enough to breathe, and asked my father what he meant, already knowing the answer but hoping, stupidly, that he'd soften it or take it back. Instead, he leaned back and sighed the way people do when they think they're being burdened by emotion, and said they were just being honest for once, that honesty was a gift, and that I should be grateful they cared enough to say it out loud. My mother reached for her wine glass and added that Lauren had always been more graceful, more driven, more naturally successful, while I was sensitive, slow to act, always needing reassurance, always needing something. I remember nodding while my face burned because nodding was safer than crying, and crying would only confirm everything they believed about me. That dinner wasn't supposed to be dramatic. It was meant to celebrate Lauren's recent promotion at her firm, something I'd congratulated her on sincerely, but somehow it had turned into a postmortem of my entire life. They talked about my job as if it were a temporary phase instead of a career, about my apartment as if it were a waiting room, about my single status as if it were a personal failure rather than a choice shaped by years of watching love used as leverage in our family. Lauren finally spoke then, tilting her head and saying she hoped I didn't take it personally, that everyone has different strengths, and that my parents only pushed me because they wanted me to grow. And I remember thinking how expertly she used words like pillows, soft enough to look kind, firm enough to smother. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection, at the familiar face that had learned to stay neutral, to give nothing away, because reactions were currency in my house, and I'd gone broke a long time ago. I splashed water on my wrists and listened to my parents' muffled voices through the door, how quickly the conversation shifted back to Lauren's achievements, how easily I disappeared once I left the room, and something settled in me then, not anger exactly, but a cold clarity, like finally understanding the rules of a game I'd been playing blind my whole life. That night, driving back to my apartment, I replayed the dinner over and over, not just my father's words but the ease with which they'd been said, the comfort my parents felt ranking their daughters as if we were resumes laid out on a desk, and I realized this wasn't an isolated moment of cruelty, it was simply the first time they hadn't bothered to dress it up. Growing up, Lauren had been the golden daughter in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Teachers praised her confidence while telling me I was sweet. Relatives asked about her future while asking me if I was happy, and my parents framed everything as concern, as guidance, as love. If Lauren failed a test, it was because the teacher was unfair. If I succeeded, it was because I'd finally applied myself, implying I usually didn't. When she spoke sharply, she was assertive. When I did, I was emotional. These distinctions were small enough to deny but consistent enough to shape a person, and by the time we were adults, the roles were fixed, reinforced by every holiday, every phone call, every comparison disguised as advice. I moved out at 22, telling myself distance would change things, that adulthood would level the playing field. But favoritism doesn't dissolve with time. It just finds new arenas. Lauren's milestones became family events. Mine were footnotes. When she needed help, my parents offered it before she asked. When I struggled, they suggested resilience. I learned to be competent quietly, to build a life that didn't require applause, and for a while that was enough. But sitting at that dinner table, hearing my father say I wasn't half the woman my sister was, something inside me recognized a truth I'd been avoiding. No amount of achievement on my part would ever shift their perception, because my role wasn't to succeed, it was to contrast. I was there to make Lauren shine brighter, to absorb the doubts, to be the example of what happens when you're not enough. When I got home that night, I didn't cry. I open my laptop and reread old emails, family group messages, texts that suddenly look different through this new lens, moments where concern tipped into control, where praise for Lauren was paired with advice for me, and I felt a strange calm replacing the ache, because clarity, even painful clarity, is a kind of relief. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with this understanding, only that I couldn't unknow it, and that pretending anymore would cost me more than their disapproval ever had. I went to bed as usual, set my alarm for work, and carried on the next day as if nothing had changed, because that's what I'd always done, but underneath the routine, something fundamental had shifted, like a fault line quietly preparing to move. And the people who thought they knew me best had no idea that the daughter they dismissed at dinner had finally stopped trying to earn a place at their table. Looking back, the dinner wasn't the beginning of the favoritism, it was just the moment when it stopped hiding, and once I allowed myself to see it clearly, memories surfaced in sharp, uncomfortable detail, stacking on top of each other until a pattern emerged that I could no longer explain away. Lauren is 2 years older than me, close enough in age that comparisons were inevitable, but far enough apart that our parents felt justified in turning every difference into a hierarchy. When we were children, she was praised for being fearless, the daughter who raised her hand first, who spoke loudly and laughed easily, while I was the careful one, the daughter who observed before acting, who felt things deeply and asked questions. Instead of seeing balance, my parents saw contrast, and instead of nurturing both, they chose a favorite narrative and stuck to it. Lauren was the leader, the achiever, the one destined for success, and I was the supporting character, the sensitive daughter who needed extra guidance, extra correction, extra patience. At school events, my parents' eyes followed Lauren instinctively, their pride visible and unrestrained, while I learned to stand slightly to the side, waiting for acknowledgement that often never came. When Lauren won awards, the celebrations were loud and communal. When I did well, the praise came with caveats, reminders not to get complacent, suggestions on how I could be better next time. It was subtle enough that I doubted myself for years, telling myself I was imagining it, that siblings are always treated differently, that my parents loved us equally in their own way. But love measured only by intention, and not by impact, leaves scars that are easy to ignore until someone presses on them. By high school, the dynamic had solidified. Lauren's mistakes were framed as learning experiences. Mine were character flaws. If she missed curfew, my parents worried about her safety. If I did, they questioned my judgment. When she chose a competitive major in college, my parents boasted about her ambition. When I chose a field rooted in analysis and long-term planning, they asked if I was sure it wasn't too safe, too small. Every family gathering reinforced the same hierarchy, relatives taking cues from my parents, praising Lauren's confidence and asking me if I was still figuring things out, as if adulthood were a destination only she had access to. I learned early that defending myself only made things worse, that pushing back confirmed their belief that I was difficult, so I adapted, becoming agreeable, self-sufficient, the daughter who didn't need much, because needing less was the only way to avoid disappointment. The warning signs were there long before that dinner, but I'd been trained to minimize them. When Lauren borrowed money and never repaid it, my parents called it support. When I declined help, they called it pride. When she spoke over me, they called it confidence. When I withdrew, they called it insecurity. Even holidays became performances, with Lauren's accomplishments woven into conversations effortlessly, while mine required prompting, often delivered with a tone that suggested surprise more than pride. I told myself that adulthood would level the field, that once we were both grown, our parents would see us as individuals rather than rivals, but favoritism doesn't fade with age, it adapts. Lauren's job offers were discussed like family victories. My promotions were acknowledged briefly before the conversation circled back to her trajectory. When she moved in with a partner, my parents offered to help furnish the place. When I moved apartments, they asked if I could manage on my own. The message was consistent and clear. Lauren was an investment and I was an experiment. What hurt most wasn't the lack of praise, it was the erosion of trust, the realization that vulnerability was unsafe around the people who were supposed to protect it. I stopped sharing setbacks because they became lectures, stopped sharing hopes because they became comparisons, and over time, I curated a version of myself that was neutral enough to avoid scrutiny. That distance I thought was maturity, but it was really self-preservation. The dinner shattered that illusion because it stripped away the pretense of concern and replaced it with judgment so blunt it left no room for doubt. My father's words weren't impulsive. They were practiced, backed by years of quiet agreement, and my mother's nod told me this wasn't a slip, it was policy. In the days that followed, I replayed moments I'd once brushed off. The way my parents consulted Lauren on family decisions but informed me after the fact. The way they framed her advice as wisdom and mine as opinion. The way they expected me to be endlessly understanding while excusing her sharpness as stress. I noticed how often Lauren positioned herself as the mediator while subtly reinforcing the hierarchy, reminding me of how much our parents worried about me, how they just wanted what was best, how I shouldn't take things so seriously. She was skilled at wearing concern like armor, deflecting accountability while maintaining the upper hand, and I realized how often I'd accepted her version of events because challenging it felt exhausting. The favoritism wasn't just parental. It was a system, one that rewarded compliance and punished resistance, and I'd been complicit in my own marginalization by believing that patience would eventually be recognized as strength. That belief kept me quiet through moments that should have prompted questions, through comments that chipped away at my confidence, through family narratives that painted me as perpetually behind. By the time of that dinner, I'd internalized the role so completely that even I measured myself against Lauren, wondering why I couldn't be louder, faster, more visibly impressive, instead of questioning why those traits were valued above all else. Understanding this didn't immediately make me angry. It made me tired, deeply and profoundly tired of trying to earn fairness in a system that wasn't designed to offer it. I went through my routines, went to work, answered calls, showed up to family obligations with the same polite restraint, but something fundamental had shifted. I stopped offering explanations, stopped volunteering updates, stopped cushioning their comments with my silence. I began to observe instead, watching how easily my parents leaned on the narrative they built, how comfortable they were dismissing my perspective, how quickly Lauren stepped into the role of the reasonable one whenever tension surfaced. Each interaction confirmed what the dinner had revealed. This wasn't about a single comment or a bad night. It was about a lifetime of favoritism that had shaped our family's power dynamics, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the cost. I didn't yet know how or when I would address it, only that pretending it wasn't real was no longer an option, and that whatever came next would require a kind of strength I'd spent years quietly developing without their approval. The real escalation came a few weeks later at my parents' anniversary party, the kind of public setting where family dynamics are usually hidden behind polite smiles. But that night the mask slipped in a way that left me exposed and cornered without a clear exit. They had rented out a small banquet room at a country club outside Columbus, inviting extended family, friends, and a handful of colleagues, and from the moment I arrived, I could feel the familiar tension settle in my chest, that quiet awareness that I was entering a space where my role had already been written. Lauren greeted me first, hugging me a little too tightly, whispering that tonight was about our parents and that we should both just be supportive daughters. Her tone gentle but instructive, like she was assigning me a part to play. I nodded, because that was easier than explaining that I was already tired of being the cooperative one, and took my seat near the back, close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid attention. The evening unfolded predictably at first, speeches filled with nostalgia, laughter at old stories that centered Lauren's childhood antics, compliments passed around like currency, and I stayed quiet, offering smiles when required, blending into the background the way I'd perfected over years. Then my father stood to give his toast, tapping his glass for attention, and as the room fell silent, I felt that familiar tightening, the instinct that told me I was about to be referenced in a way I wouldn't be able to control. He spoke about family legacy, about pride, about how grateful he was for the daughters he and my mother had raised, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to hope that the balance might be different this time. That hope lasted exactly as long as it took him to turn toward Lauren, praising her ambition, her discipline, her ability to carry the family name forward. Words that drew applause and approving nods from the crowd. When he finally mentioned me, it was as an aside, a gentle joke about how I'd always been the sensitive one, the daughter who needed more reassurance, the one who took things to heart, and the laughter that followed wasn't cruel, but it was dismissive, the kind that reduces a person to a harmless stereotype. I felt my face heat as eyes flicked toward me, some sympathetic, some amused, and I forced a smile because correcting him in that moment would have been seen as overreacting, as proving his point. My mother followed up by adding that every family needs balance, that not everyone can be a leader, and that she was proud of how I'd found my own quiet way. A phrase that landed like a compliment until you considered what it implied. Lauren stepped in smoothly, thanking our parents, saying how lucky she felt to have their guidance, and then turning to me in front of everyone, she reached for my hand and said she was grateful for her little sister's support, that I'd always been there for her, grounding her when she needed it. The room hummed with approval at the display of sisterly affection, but her grip tightened just enough to remind me that this was a performance, and I was expected to play along. I nodded, smiled, and felt something inside me harden, because being publicly defined as supportive rather than capable, as steady rather than successful, was a humiliation I could no longer pretend didn't matter. As the night went on, the comments continued in small, cutting ways, relatives asking Lauren about her next promotion while asking me if I was still happy at my job, acquaintances praising Lauren's confidence while telling me I had such a calming presence, as if calm were a consolation prize. Each interaction reinforced the narrative, and by the time dessert was served, I felt boxed in by expectations I hadn't agreed to. The final blow came when one of my father's colleagues, clearly emboldened by the evening's tone, joked that every family needs a star and a stabilizer, looking directly at Lauren and then at me, and my father laughed, agreeing without hesitation. I remember excusing myself to the restroom again, standing in front of the mirror, trying to steady my breathing as the muffled sounds of celebration seeped through the walls, and realizing that this wasn't just my family's private dynamic anymore. It was a public identity they were comfortable assigning me. When I returned, Lauren intercepted me, her expression concerned, telling me not to let things get to me, that people meant well, that I shouldn't read into harmless jokes, and her words were so polished, so reasonable, that for a moment I questioned my own reaction. That was always her strength. The ability to frame my discomfort as sensitivity, my boundaries as overthinking, and my silence as agreement. My parents echoed the sentiment later, telling me I seemed distant, asking if something was wrong, their concern arriving only after the damage was done, and when I tried to explain even gently that the comments had hurt, they dismissed it as misunderstanding, as my tendency to take things personally. The message was clear. My feelings were the problem, not their behavior. I left early citing a headache and drove home with my jaw clenched, replaying every interaction, every laugh, every approving nod, and feeling the weight of years of compliance press down on me. That night, I didn't cry or rage. I sat on my couch in the dark and allowed myself to feel the full extent of the humiliation, not just the embarrassment of the party, but the realization that my family was willing to define me publicly in ways that served their narrative, regardless of the cost to my dignity. I understood then that silence wasn't neutrality, it was consent, and by staying quiet I'd allowed them to speak for me, to shape a version of me that was easier to manage. The thought was unsettling, but it also carried a strange clarity, because if they were comfortable exposing me in front of others, then whatever came next would have to be handled differently. I was emotionally cornered, yes, but no longer confused, and for the first time the idea of continuing as I had felt more painful than the risk of change, even if that change had to begin quietly, without confrontation, without warning, while everyone else assumed I was still playing the role they'd assigned me. After the party, I didn't confront anyone, didn't send long messages or ask for explanations, because I'd finally understood something that took me years to learn. Reacting only fed the narrative that I was emotional, fragile, in need of correction, and I was done providing evidence for a story that had never been mine. Instead, I became observant in a way I hadn't been before, paying attention not just to what my parents and Lauren said, but to how decisions were made, how information flowed, and where power actually lived in our family. I still showed up to dinners, answered calls, and responded politely in group messages, but I stopped filling silences, stopped offering reassurance, stopped volunteering pieces of myself that would later be used as proof of my supposed inadequacy. The shift was internal first, a quiet detachment that felt strange and slightly dangerous, like stepping off a path I'd been told was the only safe one. I began documenting things not out of spite, but out of a need for clarity, saving messages where money was discussed differently depending on who asked, noting how my parents consulted Lauren on decisions that affected all of us while framing those same decisions to me as already settled. I reread old emails with new eyes, noticing patterns I'd dismissed before, the way my parents framed support as obligation when it came to me and as pride when it came to Lauren, the way boundaries were respected only when she set them. Around this time, I learned something that reframed everything. My parents had been quietly planning to restructure parts of their estate, conversations that included Lauren but excluded me, decisions presented to her as collaboration and to me, later, as inevitability. I found this out accidentally, through a comment Lauren made about future responsibilities, assuming I already knew, her surprise quickly masked by a reassuring smile when she realized I didn't. I didn't ask questions then. I thanked her for telling me and let the moment pass, but inside something settled into place. This wasn't just emotional favoritism. It was strategic, a long-term alignment that positioned Lauren as the responsible heir and me as the afterthought, the daughter who would adapt, who always did. I consulted a financial advisor under the guise of general planning, someone recommended by a colleague, and asked careful hypothetical questions about family assets, inheritance structures, and what rights adult children typically have when parents make unilateral decisions. I didn't reveal my suspicions. I listened, took notes, and began to understand how much of what I'd accepted as normal was, at best, ethically questionable. At the same time, I started therapy, not because I was broken, but because I needed a neutral space to untangle years of conditioning, to separate my identity from the roles I'd been assigned. Week by week, I learned to name things accurately: favoritism, triangulation, emotional manipulation, and with each label came a little more distance, a little more strength. I realized how often I'd been encouraged to doubt my own perceptions, how easily I'd accepted responsibility for conflicts I didn't create, and how deeply that habit ran. None of this made me loud or confrontational. It made me precise. I began setting small boundaries, declining last-minute requests, not rearranging my schedule to accommodate everyone else, and the reactions were telling. My parents framed my unavailability as stress, as me being overwhelmed, while Lauren checked in with concern that felt less like care and more like surveillance. She asked if I was okay, if work was too much, if I needed help managing things, and I answered honestly but briefly, offering nothing she could reinterpret. Privately, I started gathering tangible proof, not just impressions, of how differently we were treated, saving voicemails, emails, even casual texts that revealed assumptions about my role versus hers. I didn't yet know what I would do with this information, only that I needed it, that one day clarity would matter more than compliance. The internal shift was subtle but profound. Where I'd once sought understanding, I now sought accuracy. Where I'd once hoped for validation, I now focused on preparation. I upgraded my financial literacy, reviewed my own assets, ensured my independence was solid, and quietly spoke with the lawyer recommended by my advisor, framing my questions around protecting myself in complex family situations. I didn't accuse, didn't speculate aloud, but the lawyer's responses confirmed what my instincts had been telling me. Transparency mattered, documentation mattered, and silence could be costly. Through all of this, I maintained the appearance of normalcy, attending family gatherings, responding politely, listening more than speaking, letting them believe the narrative still held. Inside, though, I was no longer the daughter waiting to be chosen. I was someone who understood the system and was preparing to step out of it. There was a strange calm in that preparation, a steadiness I hadn't felt before, because for the first time, my actions weren't shaped by a need to be seen as good or agreeable, but by a commitment to protect myself. I didn't know when the moment would come, or how the truth would surface, only that when it did, I would be ready, not with anger or accusations, but with facts, boundaries, and the quiet confidence of someone who had finally stopped asking for permission to exist on her own terms. The confrontation didn't happen the way I'd imagined in moments of quiet anger. It unfolded with a calm inevitability that made it impossible for anyone to dismiss or spin, and it began when my parents called a family meeting under the pretense of clarity and unity, words that usually meant decisions had already been made. They invited Lauren and me to their house on a Sunday afternoon, their tone unusually formal, and when I arrived, I noticed a man I didn't recognize sitting at the dining table with a leather briefcase neatly placed at his feet. My mother introduced him as Mr. Harris, their estate attorney, explaining that they wanted to be transparent about future plans so there would be no misunderstandings later. And Lauren smiled at me with a look that suggested this was overdue, that I should be grateful to finally be included. We sat, and my father launched into a rehearsed explanation about responsibility, legacy, and practicality, his voice steady, almost relieved, as if putting this into words would finally resolve something. He explained that after careful consideration, they had decided to appoint Lauren as the primary executor of their estate and transfer certain assets to her ahead of time, citing her proven judgment and ability to handle complexity, while assuring me that they trusted me too, just in different ways. My mother added that this wasn't favoritism, it was logistics, that Lauren's career and temperament made her better suited to leadership, and that I would still be taken care of, though details were vague and framed as flexible. Lauren nodded sympathetically, saying she understood this might be hard for me to hear, that she'd do her best to be fair, her words smooth and measured, the picture of reason. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing slow, because this was the moment I'd been preparing for. Not emotionally but structurally. When my father finished, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for either gratitude or resistance, both of which would have confirmed their assumptions. Instead, I asked a single question, calmly, about whether the attorney could clarify how these decisions had been communicated and documented, and Mr. Harris straightened, sensing a shift. I explained, still evenly, that I'd recently consulted my own advisor about general planning, and had learned the importance of understanding one's rights and obligations, and that before responding, I wanted to ensure everything aligned with legal standards and prior representations made to me. The room went quiet, not tense yet but alert, and Lauren's smile faltered just slightly. Mr. Harris began to outline the structure, referencing documents my parents had signed months earlier, agreements that transferred partial ownership of property and established Lauren's authority in certain financial matters. And as he spoke, I asked follow-up questions that revealed gaps, inconsistencies, and assumptions. I asked when I had been notified of these changes, whether my consent had been required for decisions affecting shared assets, and how previous assurances of equal treatment had been reconciled with the current plan. My parents exchanged glances, their confidence wavering, and Lauren interjected that these were technicalities, that the spirit of the decision mattered more than the paperwork, but Mr. Harris, bound by his role, continued, explaining that while parents have broad discretion, transparency is critical, and that presenting unilateral decisions as collaborative after the fact can create legal and ethical complications. I then did something that shifted the power dynamic entirely. I placed a folder on the table, one I'd prepared quietly over weeks, containing emails, texts, and notes documenting how information had been selectively shared, how decisions were framed differently depending on the audience, and how I'd been excluded from discussions that materially affected me. I didn't accuse. I asked Mr. Harris to review them and advise whether this pattern could be construed as misleading or coercive. The room felt smaller as he read, the authority of his presence suddenly no longer an accessory to my parents' plan but a mirror reflecting its flaws. He cleared his throat and spoke carefully, explaining that while favoritism itself isn't illegal, misrepresentation and lack of disclosure can expose families to disputes, that clarity and fairness aren't just moral ideals but protective measures. My father bristled, insisting they'd done nothing wrong, that I was overanalyzing, but the defensiveness rang hollow against the quiet weight of documentation. Lauren tried to reframe, suggesting I was stressed, that this level of scrutiny was unnecessary, but for the first time, her words didn't carry the room. Mr. Harris addressed her directly, asking whether she'd been aware of how little I'd been informed, and she hesitated, then admitted she'd assumed I knew more than I did. A small concession that cracked the narrative of shared understanding. The attorney then recommended, professionally but firmly, that before any further steps were taken, all parties receive full disclosure, that decisions be revisited with everyone present, and that safeguards be put in place to ensure no one felt marginalized or misled. He suggested an independent review, possibly involving a neutral mediator, and emphasized that proceeding without consensus could invite challenges later. The authority in his voice reframed the situation. This was no longer about feelings or sensitivity, it was about process and accountability. My mother looked stunned, my father frustrated, and Lauren unmoored, her usual confidence dulled by the realization that her advantage depended on silence, not superiority. I finally spoke, not to argue but to clarify my position, saying that I wasn't asking for special treatment, only transparency and respect, that I'd spent years adapting to decisions made without me, and that I was no longer willing to do so quietly. I thanked Mr. Harris for his candor and stated that I would be seeking independent counsel to review any future plans. A declaration that landed with finality. The confrontation ended not with shouting or tears, but with a recalibration of reality, the unspoken understanding that the assumptions underpinning our family dynamic had been exposed under professional scrutiny. As I left, I felt an unexpected calm, not triumph but relief, because the truth had been spoken by someone whose authority couldn't be dismissed as emotional, and the power that had once flowed effortlessly toward my sister now faced resistance grounded in facts rather than compliance. By the time the dust settled, the changes weren't loud or dramatic, but they were unmistakable, and for the first time in my life, the silence that followed felt earned rather than imposed. My parents agreed, reluctantly at first, to pause all estate changes until an independent review was completed, and while they never apologized outright, their tone shifted in subtle but important ways, less declarative, more cautious, as if they'd realized that certainty without consent had consequences. Lauren withdrew slightly, no longer offering guidance or reassurance, her messages shorter, more neutral, and I recognized that what had unsettled her most wasn't the legal discussion itself, but the loss of narrative control, the realization that I was no longer willing to be framed for the convenience of others. Over the following months, boundaries became clearer, not because they were welcomed, but because they were enforced, and I learned that calm consistency was more effective than confrontation ever had been. The independent review confirmed what Mr. Harris had warned, that transparency had been lacking, that assumptions had replaced communication, and that moving forward required explicit consent and documented fairness, recommendations my parents accepted with a resignation that suggested they understood the alternative would be far more uncomfortable. I continued therapy not to process anger, but to solidify the sense of self that no longer depended on comparison, and with each session the weight I'd carried for years grew lighter. Family gatherings became quieter, more careful, and while the dynamic never transformed into warmth, it did evolve into something I could live with, a relationship defined by mutual awareness rather than denial. Lauren and I spoke less frequently, but when we did, there was an honesty that hadn't existed before, an unspoken acknowledgement that the hierarchy we'd grown up with could no longer be maintained without resistance. I didn't win anything tangible that day, no applause, no sudden validation, but I gained something far more lasting: agency. I stopped waiting for my parents to see me differently and started living in a way that didn't require their endorsement, building a life measured by my own values rather than their comparisons. Looking back, I understand now that the dinner where my father told me I wasn't half the woman my sister wasn't an ending. It was an unintended beginning, the moment that stripped away illusion and forced clarity into the open. Justice didn't come in the form of punishment or public reckoning. It arrived quietly through accountability, boundaries, and the refusal to be diminished any longer. I learned that moral balance isn't restored by winning against someone else, but by reclaiming the right to define yourself, even when those closest to you would prefer you didn't. If you enjoy powerful family drama stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more.